Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be learning about Unit 5 Lesson 1, which has to do with domain and range. We're going to look at the domain and range of specific functions. For the graph below, answer the following questions. So there's two questions here, and I gave you some blanks to fill in, which I will highlight here in red. So go ahead and pause the video and fill in these blanks. All right, hopefully you got a chance to fill in. So when we describe the leftmost x value and the rightmost x value on a graph, we're trying to find the leftmost or the furthest left value. In this case, I'm going to draw an arrow to it. That is the x value of -4. So the furthest x value to the left is -4, and then the largest x value, the rightmost x value, is 5. Now, conversely, when we talk about y values, lowest to highest, the bottom of this graph, I'm going to do this in blue, extends from -2 all the way up to the top here, which has a y value of +7. So in blue, what I did is I listed the lowest y value to the tallest y value. Remember, those y values go up and down. And in red, I listed the smallest x value or the leftmost value to the largest. So this concept of describing leftmost points, rightmost points, bottom, top, this has a mathematical name. So from left to right, we describe all of these x values that are defined as the domain of a function, D-O-M-A-I-N. And then when we talk about bottom top, or like the lowest y values to the biggest y value, we're talking about the range. And I want to get into a little more detail regarding domain and range. Domain and range, they're used to define x values and y values, but specifically on a function, it's only the x and y values that exist. So sometimes endpoints of graphs will be an open circle, which means that value won't exist on your domain. And sometimes there'll be an arrow at the end, which means the domain or range extends infinitely, which is exciting. It's easy to define the domain and range using something called an interval. Okay, and an interval, simply put, is just from what number to another number does my domain or range extend. So for example 1 here, it says define the domain and range using interval notation. So the way you do this is for domain, you look at the furthest left value, which we already found as -4. And notice how I'm writing -4 and I'm putting a bracket around it. What that bracket means is that -4 is included in my domain. Okay, so that bracket means included. Okay, and then we're looking for the rightmost x value, so in this case is going to be 5. So -4, and then we're going to put a comma, 5, and then we're going to end the bracket once again because we also want to include that value of 5. Think of these closed circles as included values. Okay, all right, so I'm going to swap to blue and we're going to do the range. The range of this function, remember, is bottom to top. So in this case, that's -2, and once again, I want to include that -2, and then the tallest value or the highest value is 7. And same thing, I'm including both -2 and 7. So on this next example, this is a good example of having not included values and also some infinite values. So if we don't want to include a point, we are going to use an open circle to represent that graphically. But on our interval notation, we are going to use a parentheses, okay? Additionally, if we want to define an infiniteness, you see how this graph has an arrow over here? If we want to define that infinity, we have to use the infinity symbol. So if it's going left or down, we use the negative infinity. If it's going right or up, we use the positive infinity symbol. So brings us to our example here. So we are going to do the domain and range of this graph. So if you think about domain, we're going to start at that value of -4. But because that value is not included, there's an open circle there, we're going to list that as a parentheses next to the -4 to represent that point is not included. Now, -3.99999 is included, but not -4. Therefore, we have to use that parentheses. Okay, and then the furthest right value is actually this arrow. This arrow is pointed right. It's also pointed up, but it's also going right. So we are going to say this domain is from -4 all the way up to positive infinity. I also want you to notice how I'm putting a parentheses around infinity. You never put a bracket around an infinity. It's always like an open interval. It's always like a parentheses because that infinity is going to continue extending forever. Okay. All right, let's do the range next. So the range from bottom to top, the lowest value in this case is -2, and I want you to notice how I am writing a bracket next to this -2 because that is definitely a closed circle. It's a continuous, unbroken part of the function, and then that -2 is going to extend all the way up forever to infinity. All right, example 3 here, it says define the domain and range for the following graph. The domain of this function, it's a little tricky, but I want you to notice how this domain extends leftward forever. So that arrow right there means my domain is going to start at -infinity, and then that open circle there at 4 means we extend from -infinity all the way up to 4. And then when you consider the range for this function, that is a downward arrow, so it's going to be -infinity. And I'm looking at that y value of that open circle. The y value of that open circle is 0. So my domain is -infinity to 4. My range is -infinity to 0. All right, last example. I think this one you guys can try on your own. So go ahead and practice by pressing pause on the video, and then once you're complete with the domain and range, with appropriate brackets and parentheses and infinity and negative infinities, go ahead and press play and find the answer here. Alrighty guys, so hopefully you got an answer down. The domain of this function extends from bracket -6 all the way up to positive infinity. And the range of this graph is from -5 all the way up to positive infinity. Alrighty guys, thanks for listening. I hope you learned about domain and range today. Best of luck with the homework assignment.